What's up, everybody? Welcome to Mets Off Day Live. I'm your host, Chelsea Sherrod. So happy to be joined by SNY contributor Hannah Kaiser and the Athletic's Will Sammon. How you guys doing?
Doing really well. Just got off a great homestand. It was pretty fun. Mets go on the road, so enjoying one of my first off days of the season.
Oh, and
Awesome.
you're spending it with us? Well, go do something fun.
This is fun. What are you talking about?
Wow,
I've
look
been
at
looking forward to
that.
this.
Well, we are honored to have you. But just like you're saying, coming off the second week, the Mets are one of the hottest teams in the majors right now. So we have lots to talk about. They were shut out in their final game of the home stretch against the Marlins, but they still took 5 of 6 at Citi Field and have won 7 of their last 9 overall. Hannah, I'll come to you first, though. What are your biggest takeaways from the Mets' first homestand?
Okay, I had two major takeaways from, I guess, the sort of beginning of the season overall. One is that Pete Alonso looks amazing. That's a pretty easy one. But specifically, that coming off of the way that the offseason negotiations went, and specifically coming back into a season in which he is once again playing for a contract, he looks really, really good. I was less concerned about how the offseason negotiations would affect him because he is coming back to a place where he's comfortable, and more concerned about whether whatever it was that maybe got to him last year. I know he sort of denied that it was the pressure of a contract year, but it is a contract year again. And the fact that he's looking so much more comfortable is really, really exciting and encouraging. And I'm sort of glad that whatever it was that got to him last year is not affecting him again this year. That's going to be good for the Mets and good for Pete Alonso getting another contract. And the second thing is that I was skeptical at times in the offseason that David Stearns had done enough to put together a pitching staff, and it's certainly working thus far. We're going to dig in a little bit more on that, but I credit where credit is due. This kind of mix and match, buy low philosophy, it worked last year. I thought that's the best it could possibly work, and I don't know that this will necessarily sustain at this level, but it's certainly working again. It last year I wasn't sold necessarily that it was a super replicable formula so much as like the guys they got stayed really healthy and were really effective. And even without some of that health luck, it's still looking really effective. And that's a major takeaway for David Stearns and the Mets as a whole.
Yeah, definitely 2 big standouts. Will, what are your takeaways?
Well, first, I think Hannah hit on it there with talking about some injuries. The good teams withstand injuries. Like they obviously will lose some guys over the course of a 162 game season for different periods of time, but the better teams in baseball always have guys who step up. And the Mets are demonstrating that they're one of those teams early on. And to Hannah's point about the pitching staff, David Stearns looks like he did it again as far as finding guys on the margins who could be pretty helpful. And he did it a little bit differently this time, though, because he really wanted to emphasize depth heading into the offseason. He thought, and the Mets officials thought that, hey, that's an area where, look, we're going to get our 5 or 6 starters, whatever, but we're also going to get this second wave, third wave. We're going to improve those guys. And I think that shows right away. Unfortunately for the Mets, they had 2 or 3 pitchers that they were counting on to be parts of their rotation go down with injuries. And lo and behold, they have Tyler McGill ready to go. They have other guys ready to step up and perform these roles. And they've looked really good so far. I know that things have not been perfect. They have not gotten length out of some of these guys all the time, but they're showing you that they're 6th, 7th, 8th options, and perhaps even down the road, they can be helpful contributors to this team. And again, that's the mark of a good team. So that was my first takeaway. My other one was, hey, they're taking advantage of a softer schedule right now. And they really did a number on the Marlins. I know that one game on Wednesday got away from them. It wasn't their best effort there. But for the most part, they have taken advantage of a softer schedule to start the year. And that's why, quite frankly, I wasn't all too worried about them losing Sean Manaea, losing Frankie Montas right away, because they were not going against these top lineups. These lineups, for at least for the Marlins' sake, they feature a bunch of anonymous names. I'm not even sure after watching 3 games that I could name 5 guys on their roster still, after watching intently for 3 straight days. So that was the situation. They took advantage of it, and we're going to see them, play the Athletics and then the Minnesota Twins, and that's a little bit of a chunkier lineup with some names that people know, so we'll see. But right now, all indications are this is a pretty good roster that they put together.
Yeah, they're off to a much better start than they were last season. But let's stick with the pitching staff here, Hannah, like you mentioned first. So they've been lights out to start the year. They have the best team ERA in the league. Hannah, you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but do you think that this staff can maintain this level of success? I understand, it's a long season. We could be talking about something totally different come June or July, but do you think that they can maintain this success?
I have some reasons for doubt, some cause for concern. So yes, their starters, the starting performance has been particularly impressive because of those injuries, because they got less marquee names in the offseason. And they do have the lowest ERA in baseball, but they're 21st in innings pitched. Will alluded to this. They're not going super deep into games. And that is, you are going to tire out your bullpen. You're going to overexpose your bullpen a little bit. So there's only so long. Look, we're getting the early part of the season. Pitchers are a little bit ahead of hitters. You can kind of mix and match a little bit more effectively. No one has seen the middle of your bullpen. They haven't necessarily adjusted. That strategy doesn't necessarily work forever. You can't sort of rely on less known guys from the bullpen to just come in, be lights out, and then like sort of cycle them through forever. They don't have to, though, necessarily, because of the guys who are on the injured list that they're going to get back. They're going to get back Minaya and Montas. The other thing that concerns me a little bit, starters had the third highest walk rate in baseball. They're bending but not breaking. I think we saw that a lot. I mean, they did break, I guess, in that last game against the Marlins, but Tyler McGill was working into a lot of traffic. That's not a recipe for success long term. That's also why they're not going super deep into games. They're not pitching all that efficiently. Sorry for all the like doom and gloom. They're great right now, but they are going to need reinforcements, and they're going to get those reinforcements. But right, some of the underlying numbers are cause for concern, and I would want to see the starters go a little deeper if they're going to maintain such a great sterling bullpen ERA, because at some point your bullpen does get a little overexposed and a little fatigued.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like, Hannah, that there is kind of like this changing of the guard, so to speak, or the evolution of baseball, where we are seeing starters not go as deep into games. I think we're seeing more starters go like 5 or 6 innings. We're not really seeing the 7-inning starters anymore, which does, I think, put a little bit of pressure on the bullpen. But Will, what do you credit the Mets bullpen's early season dominance to?
Well, first, I think that on the starting rotation, real quickly, I think those guys will get better as quickly, actually. I think that Clay Holmes, for instance, had his best start of the season, even though the numbers didn't look that way, right? It ended up being statistically maybe his worst start of the season when it looked from the eye test to be his best start of the season. So I suspect he'll go deeper into games pretty soon. I think Kodai Senga will go deeper into games pretty soon. And then when they get the other guys back, they should be in pretty good shape. But for right now, they built their bullpen, at least early on right now, with guys who could go multiple innings. That was by design. They knew that they were not going to get 6-7 innings from their starting pitchers. That was just not going to happen, especially after these injuries where they don't have their top guys available to them. They're relying on guys who are depth options and who will get them to maybe the 5th or the 6th inning, but certainly not more than that. So by design, they brought along guys like a Max Kranick or Huascar Brazoban who could go, and we're seeing Jose Budo there as well. He's another example who could go two innings or multiple innings at least, get you through that, maybe clean up an inning where they get you an out, where the starter leaves the game, and then they come back and they get you 3 more outs, and then they have an inning of their own. And they've been dynamite at that. They've been really, really good. So that's part of it. And the other thing that I think about all the time with the Mets is their pitching development has shown us time and time again over the last 2 years in particular that they know what they're doing, that they are really have a strong grasp of what makes these pitchers the best versions of themselves. And so it's partially identifying somebody like a Max Kranick who could be of help to you, but it's also getting the most out of that guy. So I bring him up as an example because last year he was in AAA, but they really invested in his development. Grayson Crawford, who's one of their assistant pitching coordinators, really helped him become a relief pitcher. This guy was a starting pitcher for most of his career, and they really taught him, hey, this is what we want to see from you when you are coming out of the bullpen. And so we're seeing more velocity. We're seeing sharper breaking stuff. He looks like a very, very capable guy for their pen, and they have more than that. They have other guys who are going to come up whether it's Tyler Zuber or a handful of other guys who could give you that 1 or 2 innings of length and also pitch pretty effectively. So I like what I'm seeing from them. And I haven't even spent any seconds talking about the guys in the back end, whether it's AJ Minter or Ryan Stanek or Edwin Diaz. And those guys, you could pretty much know what you're getting from them. It's just the idea of getting a bridge to them. And right now they're doing it in a way where they're relying on those multiple inning relievers. They may not have to do that come, say, May or June, but for right now, that's what's working for them.
Yeah, I think you've got to like this start, especially given some of the guys that are out right now. So, Hannah, once Sean Manaea, Frankie Montas return, who do you think will be the odd man out? And how do you think the Mets will manage that?
I think someone will get hurt. No, not like I mean, I just think I think it is always tempting fate a little bit to be like, wow, we're going to have too many pitchers on the staff. I mean, Clay Holmes is pitching really well, and I imagine he'll go deeper into games. I always did think that was a really interesting option where they could move him back into the bullpen and have this multi-inning guy. Although you're right, Will, they almost have too many multi-inning relievers right now. I was going to shout out Max Panik if you didn't. I don't know. I mean, Tyler McGill is looking better than he has in any of his appearances. So I don't know. I don't want to pick on anyone. I want to say that unfortunately this problem will probably get solved for them.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's a good problem to have, though, right? Having too many arms, so to speak. But, Will, speaking of the many arms that the Mets do have, they also have some solid ones in the minors. Brandon Sproat ranked as the top prospects. Nolan McLean striking out 8 over 4 innings in Binghamton on Sunday. How do you expect the Mets to manage these young arms as the season progresses?
Well, they're not going to hold back somebody like Brandon Sproat. If he shows that he could handle the AAA level and pitch effectively, they're not going to waste his time. They're not going to waste the Mets' time either. They're going to allow him to help their club. But he has to first do that and do that for a little period of time where he has to ace that level is really what I'm getting at. Because when the Mets prospects under David Stearns and Andy Green, when the Mets prospects have shown that they could ace a level, whether it's A or AA, AAA, whatever, they get promoted. They get moved up, and they get moved up maybe a little bit quicker than we see other organizations make those moves. They're not afraid to challenge their guys, and a lot of that is because they don't want their first signs of struggle to be at the major leagues. Like, even if they may be a little bit early on that, they'd rather have a guy who may be a little bit young or a little bit inexperienced for, say, AA to be at that level and experience some failure there. That way they better understand how to handle that aspect of the game because it's going to come. They just don't necessarily want it to come at the major league level. So in the case of Brandon Sproat, he's extremely talented. He just has to do it at AAA. He did not do that last year. So far, the results this year have been mixed. Only been a couple of starts. So we'll see. I'm pretty confident from watching him in spring training that he's the real deal here, and that he will be of help to them in some time. The other guys that you mentioned, there's Nolan McLean, there's Blade Tidwell, there's a bunch of arms down there. Again, like I said before, the Mets pitching development has really shown us that they know what they're doing when it comes to getting the most out of these guys at all levels. And so that they're built here to really pull from within rather than look to see or look to rely on external additions. They could do that too. Now that I think about it, of course, because we've seen them last year trade their younger pitchers for help. But as far as just the prospects go, I'm not going to rule them out as far as being helpful earlier than maybe we think David Stearns will pull the trigger on them.
Yeah. Will, not to put you on the spot here, but do you think that McLean gets the call up before Sproat does? What do you think the determining factor would be there?
No, I don't think so. I think that McLean still has some things that they have to show. I mean, like, if you talk to some independent scouts away from the Mets, not just Mets officials, they have some concerns of, okay, is this guy a starting pitcher? Is this guy a reliever still? So I still feel like he has some proving to do. This was also a two-way guy in college, so he is still in sort of like, I don't want to say the infancy stages of it, but he's in the early stages of just still being a pitcher. And they've thrown a lot at it. They've thrown a lot at him as far as what they want to see in terms of pitches and data. And so far he's handling it well. And it's been pretty good to watch, but he has to keep doing it, I think, over the long haul. The other guy who I should mention though is Blade Tidwell. I think that he's somebody that I know he didn't have the best of starts just last night, but he is somebody that really turned some heads in spring training. I thought he looked a lot better than he did last year. He has a firmer command of his pitches right now and knowing what to throw and when to throw it, and maybe even eliminate some of them because he's a guy like Tyler McGill who kind of throws the kitchen sink, throws every pitch imaginable. But sometimes it's better to know what you're throwing at a certain time and just rely on 3 or 4 pitches rather than 5 or 6.
Yeah, definitely a few guys to keep our eyes on moving forward. Okay, so we talked a lot about pitching. Let's talk about the Mets hitting. So the offense has been hot and cold. While the team scored 10 runs twice against Miami outside of Lindor, Soto, and Alonso, the rest of the lineup is batting under 150. Hannah, are you concerned at all about the struggles from the bottom of the order?
It kind of depends how you define concern. First of all, I would say this is why you have a top of the lineup. This is why the guys are batting at the top of the lineup. This is why you go out and get a Juan Soto, because you want to be able to get enough production out of your best hitters that the guys who are in there maybe for defense or because someone is hurt they don't have to sort of perform like superstars because they're not superstars. And so sort of similarly, like along those lines, it depends how you define concern. I don't think, and this one pains me, that Brett Baty or Luis Torrens are batting at all in a postseason or even post-trade deadline Mets lineup. I have a little bit more concern about Mark Vientos because that's a guy who you do expect to be in there in these competitive games. So that's kind of how I would balance it out. I'm not, as long as they are winning now while you're missing Alvarez, while you're missing McNeil, like while you're missing some key players, that seems good. And if you have to make some upgrades at the trade deadline, you understand that. So as long as they can get enough production out of the top of the lineup to be winning, the only guy I guess I would have concerns about is Vientos, just hoping to see him kind of put it all together again like he did last year.
Yeah, let's stick with Vientos here. Will, do you think that, or what do you think is going wrong for Mark Vientos this season? He is obviously still struggling. What do you think it is? Is it just a slump? Is he in his head a little bit? What do you kind of allude that to?
Well, first, I'm not really that worried about Mark Vientos. I'm really not. I think that he showed us last year that he could handle pressure environments. He had a great postseason. And look, this is not the first time that this guy has struggled either. I think that because it's the start of the season, it's very much more pronounced where everybody's looking at it because they expected this guy to just go off and have a great second season as a starter here. And it hasn't happened. And so we look for reasons why. And right now we see him chasing a little bit in these videos that we're showing and just overall missing and just being a little bit unsure of some pitches that are right there too, where he's looking at a third strike in that instance. But I'm just not really that worried. I think he's going to get going. Last year, he struggled in September, actually. I think people forget about that stretch where he had that. It looked awfully similar to this one, and the numbers bear it out. And then a week later, he snapped out of it, had a pretty solid ending to the season, and then went off in the postseason, like I mentioned before. So he erased some of that. This year's different. It's always a little bit different. And this year is different in the sense that he has to show us that he can handle the spotlight. He can handle being a guy and not just be that guy who operates at his best when there's a chip on his shoulder and everybody's saying, no, you can't do it. Now we're all saying, yeah, you can do it. Like, let's see it again. And he hasn't really shown it to us yet, but I think he's fine. I don't really hate his at-bats. That's why I say that I think he's fine. He, for the most part, is doing a better job of not chasing. That may have been an issue earlier on, but I liked his at-bats lately. I think it's getting there. He's ran into a little bit of misfortune as well, where he's hitting balls right at guys in some instances. So I don't hate it. I do think my only concern is the fastballs. His numbers on those are not good right now, and that's always been something that he's done very, very well. So I'm curious about that aspect of the game, but overall, I still believe that he's in for a pretty solid season.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you, Will. Really great points by you there. Hannah, you recently wrote a piece for SNY.TV on Francisco Lindor's elite ability to adjust to pitchers within games. Can you tell us about what you learned from him?
Yeah, so this was a piece that was based on some research done over at Baseball Prospectus. They were trying to look at the times through the order penalty that pitchers suffer from the batter's perspective. So we all know at this point that one of the reasons starters don't go as deep into games is because there's all this research showing that the third time they face a lineup, they do a lot less well. The batters get the advantage. So starters get pulled. But over at BP, they wanted to look at kind of who amongst the batters do the best the third time through? Who is really good at making that adjustment that we know is able to be made because we see it from the pitcher side? And so they broke it out by individual players to see who improves the most first time seeing a starting pitcher versus third time. And they found that last year, at least, Francisco Lindor, best in the majors at this. Also worth noting, Juan Soto was third, Brandon Nimmo was 10th. And so I talked to Lindor about this. First of all, I asked him if he knew this, and he didn't. In fact, initially, he thought that I was talking about the idea of getting better the more times you see a pitcher over the course of the season. And he was like, I do feel more comfortable. And he pointed to last year at the end of the year when they faced the Milwaukee Brewers at the end of the regular season. And then again, really, really quickly in the postseason. He was like, I felt so much more comfortable. And that made me think, well, maybe that explains a little bit of why Francisco Lindor tends to get off to a slow start and then get better as the season goes on. He feels more comfortable when he's seeing these guys a second or third time over the course of the season, but also sort of within a game. And he was talking about all the things that you can't prepare for. So what's interesting about this is we have a lot of technology to allow guys to prepare, not just, notes and heat charts and all that, but they have this fancy traject arc that's supposed to perfectly replicate pitchers' arsenals. And so I asked specifically about that, like, if you can do that pregame, doesn't that kind of close the gap? And he was pointing to all the things, whether it's the weather or how a guy's particular pitches are moving in that day or how a catcher is setting up, even how the infield defense is playing you that you don't necessarily know until you get into a game. And then we saw this yesterday. He made 2 outs against the Marlins starter who was really, really good, and then had the first hit to break up the no-hitter yesterday. And you saw him sort of adjust and go up the middle there. That's a really good skill, not just for him, but for the rest of the lineup. I mean, one of the things that if you watch a lot of Mets games, is Francisco Lindor is a guy who's often talking to the other hitters. He's going over and sort of putting his glove in front of his face and telling them what he's seeing. And I asked him specifically about that. And I thought this was so interesting. He was saying that the longer he's around the club, the sort of more entrenched he gets with this core of Mets players, the more he learns how guys want that information to be relayed to them and who does and does not want that information, who wants it before they're at bat and who doesn't want it necessarily right before they go up to the plate because they already have an attack plan. He was saying he's learning which guys want to know the shapes of pitches versus the sequence that the pitcher might throw them. And I thought now that the Mets have him and Soto, another guy who's really, really good at this at the top of the lineup, that maybe we will start to see that benefit some of the guys further down in the lineup over the course of the season.
Yeah, and I think that just speaks to the high level of baseball IQ that guys like Lindor and Soto have for them to be able to notice that in game and make the adjustments in real time. But Hannah, a quick follow-up. How valuable is that knowledge for younger hitters on this roster, especially when we're, talking about Vientos and Baty? How can that knowledge help them?
I imagine that being around someone who's naturally good at that and hearing those little in-game tips will help those guys improve at that over the course of their career, because that is a really valuable skill, because it's the kind of skill that you can't necessarily do anything with from a front office perspective. Like you either in fact, I asked David Stearns, and then I was on SNY last night. I asked Zach Scott, another GM, about this. How do you sort of use this skill to build a team? And he was like, other than putting this guy at the top of the lineup, letting him look at pitches, which you're going to do with Francisco Lindor anyway, because he's just such a good hitter, there's not a lot that a team can necessarily do. It's just a skill that benefits the player. If it benefits the team once they're sort of in game, but this is a tough one to kind of manufacture. It's something that you have to just learn from at-bats and maybe from guys who are naturally good at this. You have to kind of learn what it is that you are trying to adjust to, that you can adjust to, that you can get from one particular at-bat and take into the next at-bat. I asked Lindor specifically, when you're watching your own at-bats between at-bats, so, guys go back to the dugout and they look at the iPads, what are you looking for? Trying to get a sense of what are these things, these skills that he's kind of taking with him from at-bat to at-bat. And he said he's not looking for sequencing. He said, I remember the sequencing. I'm looking to see whether I made the right decision, whether or not to swing at certain pitches. So, you're making the decision to swing before the ball gets to the plate. And then he likes to go back and look and see, okay, that's where I thought that ball was going to go whenever it was that I made the snap decision to swing or not. Because he said, I can hit anybody, but if I take the wrong swings, I'm not going to do damage against them. So he wants to make sure that he's not just making contact, but that he's choosing the right pitches to swing at, so that when he does make contact, he's doing damage.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes Francisco Lindor one of the best of the best. Make sure you guys all check out Hannah's article on SNY.TV. Some really valuable info in that one. Okay, let's talk about some injury updates here. Will, so the Mets are dealing with multiple injuries right now. I'm going to go through a few names, and I'd like for you to give us the latest on what you're hearing from these players. So the first name is Francisco Alvarez. What's the latest?
Well, Francisco Alvarez started a rehab assignment last night in Port St. Lucie. He played 5 innings. He has to sort of show us that he could do that for 9 innings, probably multiple back-to-back days before the Mets consider him a player for them. But he's a fast healer. He always has been. He's had these injuries in the past where he has beaten timelines and shown us that he could heal a lot quicker than the average person. So it's a good sign that he's already at a rehab assignment. It's just probably going to take a little bit more time for him to get back to the Mets.
Yeah, can't wait to have him back. Next guy up, Sean Manaea. Will, what are you hearing?
Yeah, unfortunately for Manaea, he suffered a setback in his road to recovery from that spring training injury. It was that oblique issue that he had, and unfortunately for him, he sort of re-aggravated it a little bit and needed to be shut down for 2 weeks. That's what Carlos Mendoza said about a week ago. So he still has some time before he's even throwing. And after that, he needs to pretty much go a full stretch of spring training to build back up to become a player for the Mets. So he's looking at still a lengthy period of time before he's a contributor here and somebody that the Mets can count on, unfortunately, because he had that injury right at the wrong time of spring training where he wasn't even able to make a spring training start. So he has to really build up to get back to that level.
Yeah, hoping for a speedy return for him. Next guy up is Luis Torrens. Will.
Yeah, Torrens has been really a revelation for this team, really ever since they picked him up from the Yankees for like $100,000 in that deal last year, and it really helped them turn things around last season. And he got off to such a terrific start. Such a good guy to be around in the clubhouse as well. But he had that forearm issue. The Mets sent him for an MRI after he needed some time, a little bit more time than they originally thought. But the MRI showed up negative, which is a positive for them. It showed that there was nothing else wrong with it aside from bruising. So that's a good thing. He still didn't start or play in Wednesday's game. That was sort of expected after the MRI. They were trying to get him through this stretch where they had the Wednesday game plus the day off today to kind of get him to the weekend series. And hopefully they're expecting him to be in the lineup for that series.
Okay, good to hear. Last guy for you, Jeff McNeil. What's the latest?
Yeah, McNeil will soon be joining Francisco Alvarez if he isn't already in these rehab games. It's a little bit of an extended spring training for McNeil, too, because he, again, had that injury early on in spring training, wasn't able to get into too many games himself. So he's going to work his way back. These oblique injuries can be tricky, so they're not going to accelerate it too much. I think that they're going to be a little bit cautious here. But it's somebody that they need because of that second base situation. They've gotten the least production as far as OPS goes in the entire major leagues at second base. And so Jeff McNeil, when he returns, he should be a boost. But they're not going to necessarily rush him back either. He has to show that he could, again, similar to Alvarez, although not quite as much with him being a catcher, but he has to show that he could play in some games and that he doesn't need that break right away. Otherwise, there's really no point in rushing the guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks so much for those updates. But speaking of second base, Hannah, as we've said before, Brett Baty continues to really struggle after having an impressive spring. Do you think this is a skill issue? Is this a mental issue? Is it a pressure issue? What do you think is happening with Brett Baty?
I have to think, I don't know what's going on in Brett Baty's head, but I have to think that this is a little bit of a mental issue that's becoming an approach issue. If you just look at the numbers, like he's had a significant number of at-bats, both in the minors and in the majors. Okay, I have some numbers, so I'm going to be looking down real quick. In the minors, more than 1,400 plate appearances. He's slashing. He's got an OPS of 889 in spring training this year. We saw he had an OPS over 1,000 slash 353, 441, 745. That's a decent sample size between the minors and what he did in spring this year. And then you look at what he's done in the majors, which is now over 600 plate appearances, and that's where guys do start to calcify, and you got to get a more real sense of who they are. Slashing 210, 275, 317, and that's across several years. So it really does feel like there is a gap in what he's able to do when the games, quote unquote, don't matter versus when they do. And it does feel like we've reached a point where the pressure is inevitable. We know that he's getting a chance now because McNeil is hurt, and this might be his last chance. He's out of options. So there's not it's inevitable that he is feeling some amount of pressure. And what we're seeing is he's either succumbing to that pressure or he's changing his approach because he feels that pressure. And it all goes back to, it has to be mental in some capacity, because he's just not able to translate the success that he's having at these lower levels and in spring training into major league games when there is this shorter timeline, more intense pressure, and he's running out of both literal and sort of figurative options with the Mets.
Yeah, it seems like, especially with, the top of the order, the offense clicking for the most part, it seems like Baty's bat is the bigger issue. So, Will, what do you think the Mets will do if Baty doesn't improve by the time Jeff McNeil returns? Because it feels like if he doesn't hit, he's not going to stay in that role.
He can't. He just can't, to be completely simple about it. It's just not going to work. And look, it may not even work for Luis Angel Acuna for that matter if he doesn't get going either. Acuna is a little bit different because he offers some speed and a little bit better defense at some different positions. Second base, shortstop, third base. He could play center field as well even. So he could do a little bit differently, but he may need some time in AAA to just get more at-bats as well and play every day. So I don't know. I'm not looking for Brett Baty to get demoted or anything before Jeff McNeil returns. I don't think that's going to be an option. They're not going to do that to his confidence and disrupt it any further. But once McNeil returns, and if Baty has not gotten going, I think that the Mets would be better served to add a veteran even to that mix and add somebody who's also a right-handed bat as well, because you don't necessarily need Brett Baty as a left-handed bat if you have Jeff McNeil there. So I look at it that way. As far as, like Hannah said, he has not shown us that he could handle major league pitching, at least not on a consistent level at all yet. So I don't think he has much to prove in AAA necessarily, because the numbers show us that he's done fairly well every single time. And same thing with spring training. He's done that. He's aced those tests in some ways, but it just has not clicked here. So I don't know, maybe they look to even move him in a trade or give him a change of scenery and maybe get some more pitching or something like that in return. I don't know. It's an unfortunate situation for him because he does have that talent. And when you hear Carlos Mendoza or David Stearns talk about him, they bring it up because it's not a fabrication. It's not fake. It's real. This guy has gotten to this point because he is who he is, and he's a talented kid and somebody that has been talented his whole life at this. And so it's unfortunate. I do think that he has raised the question of whether a change of scenery is needed, especially if he does not get going in these next couple of weeks. But again, for him, it's been a series of 25 at-bats. So I know the numbers look ugly right now, but I say we give him another week or two, especially since McNeil is still going to be out for a little while before we make that determination.
Yeah, well, let's hope for the Mets' sake that a good change of scenery would just be them going out to the West Coast to Sacramento, getting away from Citi Field and seeing how he performs out there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Vlad Guerrero Jr. and the Pete Alonso impact of that deal that he signed, because this is obviously the biggest news or one of the biggest stories to come out over the past week. So he got a 14-year, $500 million extension with the Blue Jays. It doesn't seem like the Mets were ever going to pay that type of money for Vlad. But Hannah, how do you think this does affect Pete Alonso's contract? Obviously, Pete is a little older than Vlad. The situations are different, but how do you think that impacts him at all?
I don't know that it impacts him all that much. It can only help him, certainly, to sort of raise the overall first base market. But this felt, frankly, like an overpay by a front office that needed a win and saw a really impactful and almost obvious win in retaining their homegrown star and a guy who's a really, really good player. Certainly, it's not that he doesn't deserve the money. It's just that the leverage was certainly with Vlad. In fact, I was surprised this deal got done when it did, because it seemed like, well, at this point, he's just going to test the market. Why not? He's gotten so close, and they passed his imposed deadline. But obviously, the Blue Jays were willing to do kind of whatever it took to get this deal done. And that's not something that the Mets are ever going to do with Pete Alonso. We saw that last year. They're not going to do, like, they not only did they give him the $500 million, but like $375 million of it is in bonuses, which is not taxed and not subject to proration if there is missed games in 2027 or a lockout. So they were motivated to get this done with this one particular guy. And so it's hard to see a situation based on what happened this last offseason. We already know the Mets are not going to take that kind of mentality into negotiating with Pete. And they're the only team that would have that mentality of like, we got to get it done with this one particular guy. I will say that I think Pete is helping his market with his own production. That probably goes further than anything that happened with Vlad Guerrero Jr. Pete's looking great. He's performing well. He's off to a much better year than he was last year. And that's what he can do to kind of affect his market. And in some ways that's better because he can control that himself. And the age thing is always going to be against him, sort of in comparison to Vlad. But if he can show that he is as impactful an offensive player, that'll help his market.
Yeah, I mean, so far he's showing that. It does seem like he's playing with a little more freedom, and he's not really feeling the pressure as much either. But Will, do you see a scenario where the Mets do extend Pete mid-season or after the season before his contract expires, especially if he continues to perform at this level?
I wouldn't rule it out, but I also have not heard anything that makes me think that that will happen. So I want to be careful to say like, oh, no, it's not going to happen. And, it's just something that I don't really know about, but I haven't really heard anything that would make me think that that's on the track to happen. I think people forget that sometimes that Scott Boras is Pete Alonso's agent, and not that Scott Boras never does extensions. They're a little bit on the rare side, but he has done them in some ways. With Matt Chapman was a good example last year, even with the San Francisco Giants, and that happened late into the season after a free agency that didn't go the way that people thought. But Matt Chapman is a different player than Pete Alonso. Matt Chapman is a premier defensive player, somebody that is not a first baseman, and so I don't think that Pete Alonso's market necessarily changes all that much, just because unfortunately he was probably born in the wrong time for this, because years ago, a big first baseman, power hitting first baseman, it didn't really matter if he was 29, 30, 31, he was going to get paid. And these days it's just not the same. So he's still facing those same question marks as he did last offseason of, hey, this guy's going to be on the wrong side of 30 years old. He plays first base. I will say, though, that I think defensively he does not get as much credit as he deserves. I know he doesn't have as much range as some of these other guys do, and he may never have that, but he does a really good job of scooping balls out of the dirt. He does some other things that the Mets infielders will be quick to tell you saves them a bunch. So I think I'm with Hannah 100%. I nodded my head throughout everything that she said, just because the biggest part of this for Pete Alonso is Pete Alonso has to produce the way Pete Alonso is capable of producing. And if he does that, the market for Pete Alonso will be a lot better than whatever it was last offseason. And that's something that he can handle. And that is something that he is showing us he's ready to do in 2025.
Yeah, we'll see if he does it throughout the season. All right, well, that's going to do it for us here on Mets Off Day Live. We got some really great gems from Hannah and from Will. This was a lot of fun to talk about all these different things that we've seen over the past couple of weeks. The Mets head to the West Coast and will face the Athletics and their old friend, Luis Severino. So for Hannah Kaiser, for Will Sammon, I'm Chelsea Sherrod. Thank you so much for joining us on Mets Off Day Live, and we will see you on the next one.